based on a book that I read a while back. And I put it under one of the storytelling manuals, because it does indeed tell a very unlikely story, the kind of thing that you couldn't make up. The book is entitled Thinking Small, The Long Strange Trip of the Volkswagen Beetle. Now, first of all, let me ask, have any of you ever owned or driven a Volkswagen Beetle, the old Beetle? Okay, a few of us have. I never owned one, but there's a very personal connection with Volkswagen Beetles to my family, but I'm not going to get into that now, maybe in a subsequent speech. This book, Thinking Small, The Long Strange History of the Volkswagen Beetle, was written by a woman named Andrea Hyatt. And I thought she did a fabulous job of telling this unlikely story by following three main tracks, really three characters from history in the last century. And the first of those is Ferdinand Porsche. Ferdinand Porsche was born in the late 1800s. He designed his first car in 1900. He was not formally trained as an engineer or a designer, but he was one of these natural-born geniuses. And he had a genius for designing cars. He worked for various car companies in the early 1900s, most notably for Daimler. And Daimler later became Daimler-Benz. We know it more familiarly as Mercedes-Benz, but the parent company of Mercedes-Benz is still Daimler. So he worked for them, and he always worked on the racing end of things. He designed and built race cars in the early 1900s. In 1930, he decided to start his own company, which, oddly enough, he named Porsche. And I think we're all probably familiar with that line of products. Porsche was always interested, he always worked in the race end of the automobile design business. But he always had it in his head that he wanted to produce a mass-produced, cheap, reliable car for the masses, a car that would put Germany, in this case, on wheels. Now, that wasn't an original idea totally, because Henry Ford had done that here in the United States and really revolutionized our whole country. But Porsche wanted to do that for Germany. So he had this idea, and not just an idea, but he actually put it down on paper as a design. So he had this idea and a design. He had his own company, but he didn't have a factory to build this vehicle. And this brings in our second character in this book, and that is Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany in 1933. And by the late 30s, he was dictator or Führer of Germany. And as we all know, he had a lot of really terrible ideas, but he had a couple of good ideas. And one of those was to build the Autobahn. And this was a network of interstate highways in Germany. Ironically, after World War II, Dwight Eisenhower, who led the Western Allies across Western Europe, saw these Autobahn in Germany, and he came back and brought that idea back to the United States, and when he became president of the United States, implemented it here. So this is basically where our interstate highway system came from. The other good idea that Hitler had was the same idea that Ferdinand Porsche had, and that was to build a people's car, to put Germany on wheels, the average citizen. So he had at his disposal by the late 30s the means to bring that about. He got together with Ferdinand Porsche, saw that Porsche had a design on paper, and Adolf Hitler provided the means to build this factory. And the factory was located in Wolfsburg in Germany, which is about 100 miles west of Berlin. So this factory was built under the tutelage of Ferdinand Porsche, and it started to produce the people's car, which in German is Volk. The Volk is the people, and Wagen means car or vehicle. So Volkswagen began to churn out Volkswagens. However, Hitler then implemented one of his extraordinarily bad ideas, that being of world domination, by invading Poland in 1939, thus sparking World War II. And we all know how that turned out. 6 years later, Hitler blows his brains out in a bunker underneath the ruins of Berlin, and much of Germany had been ruined. The Allies had pounded it from the air, the Russians had come in from the east, and the Allied armies from the West under Dwight Eisenhower. Germany was divided into 4 occupation zones: the Russian, French, British, and American. And there was a lot of sentiment at that time, after World War II, that Germany as a country should be not only demilitarized, but deindustrialized, so that it could never again have the means at its disposal to start another world war. The French were big on that idea, having suffered greatly under Hitler's rule. But the British and the Americans recognized that the Soviet Union was the new threat. The Soviet Union had no intention of giving back any of the territories or countries that it had overrun during World War II, or to allow them any sort of freedom. So Britain and the United States realized that Germany didn't need to be remilitarized, but did need to be reindustrialized so that it could be at least an economic power. And the Wolfsburg plant, the Volkswagen plant, happened to fall in the British occupation zone, and the British had the foresight to get that plant up and going again. And so, right after World War II, that Wolfsburg plant began to churn out Volkswagens again, the Volkswagen Beetle specifically. And these things began to sell all over Germany and then all over Europe. But Volkswagen, once it got going again, had the audacity to want to crack the American car market. The American car market, by far, at that time, was the place to be. I mean, Detroit was churning out millions of vehicles. And this is where this was where the action was worldwide. So Volkswagen, by 1949, not that long after World War II, started to sell Volkswagens in the United States. In 1949, they sold exactly 2 Volkswagens in the United States. And they kind of, I won't say stumbled, but they built very slowly through the 1950s, selling a few more cars and establishing a few more dealerships here and there and that sort of thing. But they never hit the big time in the United States. And they had this weird little car that was shaped like a Beetle, and hence its name. It had the gas tank and the trunk in the front, and every American car was the other way around. The engine sat in the back and drove the rear wheels, and the engine was air-cooled. Now, every American car at that time had a water-cooled, mostly big 6 or V8 engine in it. So it was completely out of its context here in the United States at that time. It was just a strange little car. And Volkswagen had this dilemma: we want to sell this car in the United States. How do we go about that? And that brings our third character in this little drama in, and that person is a guy named Bill Bernbach. Bill Bernbach was a Jewish advertising executive in New York City. He had worked for various firms in New York City and was successful as an advertising person. And he wanted to do things differently and on his own. So along with a couple of associates, he started his own advertising firm, their own advertising firm, called Doyle Dane Bernbach. Doyle Dane Bernbach. Volkswagen got hooked up with Doyle Dane Bernbach. And Doyle Dane Bernbach's take on things was they did things a little differently. They thought outside of the box. They were a very creative group of people. And that was their trademark. If you wanted the typical advertising campaign, you went to one of the big firms in New York City. If you wanted something with a different slant on it, a little more hip, a little more creative, you went to Doyle Dane Bernbach. So Volkswagen got hooked up with them, and specifically with Bill Bernbach. And Bill Bernbach's team came up with an advertising campaign. Just as an aside, one of Bill Bernbach's people that worked for him was a Jewish guy, and he had a moral problem with helping Volkswagen come into this country in a bigger way, because it had been co-founded by Adolf Hitler, for one thing. And then during the war, when it was converted to a war factory, it was making things like bazookas, and it made these little light reconnaissance vehicles called Kubelwagens. And the plant utilized slave labor during the war. So he had a problem with this, but he overcame that and took it on as a professional responsibility. So this team under Bill Bernbach's direction came up with a advertising campaign called Think Small. Now let me back up here just a second. This is what was selling by 1959 in the United States. This is a magazine ad for a Cadillac. And look at that thing. It's long, it's wide, it's cushy inside. If you sit inside it, I'll pass this around. It's like sitting on your couch, and it rode that way. It's got a big V8 engine in the front, driving the rear wheels. It's got flashy chrome. It's got big tail fins. Elvis Presley drove one of these, for gosh sakes. The other thing I would draw your attention to with this is how American cars were advertised at that time. If you went to an ad agency to sell your Cadillac, they came up with something that looked like this. I'll pass this around. Bill Bernbach's team came up with an advertising campaign that is now recognized as being a classic, not just for its effectiveness, but just for the boldness of it and the thinking outside the box-ness of it, if you will. And it came out with this Think Small advertising campaign. Now you'll note that picture of that Cadillac takes the Cadillac takes up the whole picture. On this one, it's mostly a gray blank page of nothing. But there's a little picture up in the corner here of a Volkswagen Beetle, and there's a little bit of text. It says Think Small, and there's a little bit of text that extols the virtues of the Volkswagen Beetle. It's thriftiness and gas mileage, and it doesn't wear out tires very quickly, and it's good in the snow. It was very good in the snow compared to American cars because the engine sat over the rear wheels, driving the rear wheels, so it had more traction. There was another one of these that I'll pass this around as well. You can't read that text, I'm sorry, but there was another one that I remember seeing as a kid, and it showed a driving blizzard. And you see a set of headlights coming at you, and then you recognize that it's a Volkswagen Beetle, and you see a guy, he's driving this Beetle through this horrible snowstorm. And you see it winding along the roads, and it finally pulls into a highway garage. And the guy gets out of the car and goes in the highway garage, the lights come on, the doors open of the highway garage, and the plow truck comes out. And the ad says very simply, how did you think the guy that drives the snowplow gets to work? So Bill Bernbach and company came up with this sort of clever that made the Volkswagen, extolled its virtues, and made it look like a hip kind of a thing, you know, something different. If you thought differently about the world, you would consider a Volkswagen Beetle. Also, right at that moment in our country, there was a wave coming of a sort of a countercultural aspect to our society, where people were reacting against some of the excesses of American culture, perhaps epitomized by that Cadillac. Everything had to be supersized. Everything had to be overdone. It was anti-military, anti-war type thing. And of course, in the mid-1960s, the Vietnam War was ramping up. That became very unpopular. And this sort of countercultural thinking, anti-establishment thinking, if you will, started to sweep the country. And Volkswagen, the Volkswagen Beetle, rode that like a wave with the help of this advertising campaign and became hugely popular. And the Volkswagen Beetle became the best-selling car in the world. For a number of years, it's been since superseded by the Toyota Corolla. But for many years, it was the best-selling car in the world. And when you think about that, how it started, and how it almost went extinct after World War II, and was revived, and managed to winkle its way into the United States market and become hugely popular, and not only became popular, it became a symbol of that counterculture. If you were a self-respecting hippie in the 60s or 70s, you drove a Volkswagen Beetle or a Volkswagen microbus. And that is the story that Andrea Hyatt tells about how this unlikely vehicle came to be the best-selling car in the world. I found it a fascinating read, and I hope you enjoyed it as well. Thank you.